What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. I suck at welding. I mean, look at this trash. We've got stainless and aluminum. I don't even know what to say about this. Aluminum, I'm dipping the tungsten everywhere and it's just bad. But we've got to get good at this because I've got to turn all of this aluminum tube into intercooler piping, and I need to get some stainless to make the turbo downpipe for this Turbo K24 swap Subaru BRZ. So let's see if I can't do some practice and get a little bit better. And let me see if I can give you guys some tips so that if you're just starting to TIG weld, just learning the basics, maybe I'll have some tips for you guys as well. Let's jump into it. So it was about a year ago, or maybe a little bit longer than that, that I bought this Prime Weld TIG 225 so that I could start learning how to TIG weld. Now, I've been so busy with the build and getting the engine dropped in and everything that I haven't really spent a whole lot of time at the table. So I'm basically starting from scratch again, despite the, I don't know, maybe 20 to 30 hours or so that I had spent practicing in the past. Now, what I'm going to be focusing on today is aluminum. We're going to be using some 1/8 inch and some 1/16 inch sort of coupons from weldmetalsonline.com. Not sponsored, but if you need weld metals, weld materials, they've got everything you need. Link in the description if you want to check that out. It's just a good resource to get materials from. So I have 2-inch tube and 2.5-inch tube in the box under that, and I'm going to be using this to essentially create intercooler piping. I have my Mishimoto intercooler right here that I'm gonna need to mount up as well, and I'm still kind of gonna have to figure out how I'm gonna get that mounted, whether I mount it to the front sort of subframe or if I mount it to my bash bar. I'll figure something out there. But today we're basically just gonna be practicing and trying to get a little bit better at our aluminum TIG welding. Aluminum's a little bit tricky. Now, of course, because of the fact that I am also a beginner, I don't claim to be good. You've obviously seen the work that I've been able to produce up to this point. Now, because of the fact that this is not a welding channel, I'm not gonna have any, tight arc shots. Like, I don't have the right filter or the right camera or anything like that. So, I am not really in a position to instruct exactly how you should TIG weld anyway. So, what we're going to be doing is I'm just going to sort of explain my thought process on how I'm basically putting pieces together, and basically just what's going through my head as I'm either setting up or tacking or doing the actual welds. And then I'll show you guys what I'm doing as I go along, but unfortunately I don't have the setup to get like nice proper arc shots. What I'm going to be doing is the equivalent of a butt weld, right? So for intercooler piping, or really most piping in general, you're just taking the round outside of each pipe, butting it up right next to itself or to the other piece, and you're welding the outside of that. So in order to kind of practice that is you can take two flat pieces and stick them together basically with no real overlap or anything. You're just trying to take these two pieces, stick them right together like so, and weld in a straight line. This is kind of the beginning phase before you actually get to welding tube, because when you change from flat stock to actually welding tube, there's a lot more variables that go into it from a physical perspective. You're not just going in a straight line anymore. Now you're having to move both of your hands with your torch hand as well as your filler rod hand, and you're having to move in a circular motion around the tube. So there's obviously a difference. Even if you get good at this, you may still have some problems when you actually go to weld tubes together. But this is kind of the first step, and this is what I've been working on. If you follow the 1 amp per thousandth of an inch, this is 1/8 of an inch, which is the equivalent to 125 thousandths of an inch. So we would weld these two pieces together at 125 amps. So that's what we're gonna start with. Obviously, because we're using aluminum, we're gonna be welding on AC, not DC. So more or less, I'm just gonna take my two pieces, get them matched up nice and tight on the table, and then I'm gonna take these two, set them down on top to hold them in place while I get my tacks, because aluminum, especially thinner aluminum, not necessarily 1/8, but 1/16 definitely, likes to distort. So if you're welding on the top of the piece of metal, if if you're welding on this surface of these two, when you start to tack, and especially when you start to weld all the way across, these two pieces are going to want to sort of flare up. And so having these sort of hold downs really helps with just trying to avoid some of that distortion. So let me get geared up. I'll talk about kind of what I'm going to do for these tack welds and how we're going to go about this. I'm using 1/16 inch aluminum filler. I'm using a number 5 cup because on aluminum you don't need a ton of shielding gas. You do need some so that your tungsten doesn't experience any oxidation, but you don't need the same that you would for stainless where you have 20-25 CFH of argon pumping out through like a number 12 cup. So I'm using a number 5 cup, 10 to 12 CFH on my argon flow, 1/16 inch filler, 1/8 inch plate, and yeah, we're gonna go ahead and tack this down at 125 amps. You know what I completely failed to do? Clean my part. That's rookie mistake number 1. Yeah, mistake number 1 for this video. Okay. All right, yeah, I knew that I had cleaned my filler rod previously, but I failed to acknowledge the fact that I did not wipe these parts down with acetone, and whenever I struck up my arc, after I got it tacked, I took the arc off and then I looked at it and I was like, there's just a lot of gross, nasty junk in there. And then I realized I was so focused on the video, I wasn't focused on actually properly doing the weld, because this is not a welding channel. It's the first real welding video I've made. So make sure to use some acetone and clean your parts properly. Oh man, sometimes I even managed to surprise myself. Wiped down with acetone, so we should be good to go there. Let's try for tack number 2. So let's give you guys a little look at how these tacks turned out. So yeah, this was the first one I did before I cleaned it. And yeah, you can tell that there's a good amount of just kind of that black oxide sitting on top, just that nasty stuff. That's what you don't want. And this is a little bit better. There's still some garbage in there, but that's one of the biggest differences when it comes to cleaning your part. Right side versus left side. Again, we're using 125 amps. We're going to try and hammer into this thing at full amperage the whole way through, right up until the end. We're going to have to start tapering off so that we don't blow this edge away. First attempt, literally as I strike up the arc, I dip the tungsten immediately. It goes bap, 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 bap. Dipped. So I'm not going to try to continue welding with that. I'm just going to go ahead and pull this out and replace it with a fresh tungsten. Practice run's feeling good, or practice swings rather. Foot on the pedal. Let's try again. I am really struggling today. That's 2 dipped tungstens within about 5 minutes. Not even 5 minutes, about 2 minutes. Well, all my other tungstens are already spoiled, so might have to clean up some fresh tungsten and come back. So let's talk about the difference between a bad weld and a good weld. Obviously, this is filled up with a whole bunch of little practice runs and such. And the main difference between these two is that this is 16th inch plate and this is 1/8 inch plate. So I dipped the tungsten on my very first start. I replaced the tungsten with a good one, started to go through, was moving along decent, dipped again. So when you see that big black puddle of oxides and just junk, as soon as you dip the tungsten, if it goes out and comes back on, that's how you know you dipped. And time to change out that tungsten, get a fresh one, clean off this surface with maybe, you know, definitely some acetone, a red Scotch-Brite, maybe even a wire brush, something along those lines. I'm so concerned about trying to keep the torch as close as possible for heat management and just, you know, proper penetration and all that, that I end up dipping more often than I would like to admit, but it is what it is as you're learning and sort of trying to get better. Now, I do want to talk about this guy right here. Ignore all of the junk that's on the plates. I'm just going to talk about what is going on here, right in the center for the join. I'm actually somewhat happy with this one. I'm pretty proud of it because I'll show you the penetration on the back in a second, which has been my biggest problem. I've been afraid to commit to the amps, and that ends up just causing yourself a whole lot of other problems. So this is 16th inch plate, so 62.5 thousandths of an inch. But so you can, you know, typically you'd have your machine set to 62, 63, somewhere in there. If we take a look, you can see that I started out too hot. You can see that how sort of wide this is at the beginning before I kind of get into my rhythm and it starts to become somewhat decent. And you can see how flat that is, as opposed to over here, you can actually see the dab profile. As I was going along, you can see where I was adding filler rod, but because of how hot it was right here at the beginning, there's not really a whole lot of definition there. I just was, I started up the arc, I got my weld pool, and I just took a little bit too long to get going. And I don't know if you'll be able to tell sort of how flat that is. You can kind of see how almost sunk in this is, as opposed to how these have a decent little dab profile for every single one of them. So that indicates to me that I was too hot at the start. Not that I was running too many amps, but because that I was moving too slow. You know, I had an appropriate amount of amps here, I just got moving too slow, so that amperage that I was feeding into it was just spreading, was just becoming a big heat sink. So as I got going, I got sort of into my comfortable rhythm, and you can see that we got, you know, pretty decent little dab profile here. Around here, I started to taper off on my amperage. So I backed off of the foot pedal just a little bit, the equivalent of maybe 5 amps or so. As you get closer to your edge here, if you don't start backing off of your amps, this heat has nowhere else to go. And so you could essentially just put a giant crater in the end of your piece, because as you're leading this heat all the way up to this edge, if you're not backing off or reducing the heat that you're putting into the system, it has nowhere to go, and all of this will be your entire heat catch will be in this area here. So start backing off of your amps maybe, you know, 3/4 of an inch before the end of this plate. Despite all of that, you know, despite all of the self-critique, if we flip this over and look at the back, so this is the side that I started on. So it's, you know, obviously because we're looking at the back side, the direction is going to be opposite. But you can see that I punched through pretty much this entire thing. I might have tapered off just a little bit too much here and then had to punch back in. You can really see the back side of this weld, how it carried all the way through. And so if we were to cut, you know, essentially cut this all the way down the middle and sort of etch the center of this, you could see that I think, obviously I haven't done this, but I think I got pretty decent penetration there in the middle. So that was the most successful run I've had out of, you know, all of the different pieces, all of this stuff. Most of it is not terrible, but not good enough, right? So we need to get to the point where we can do this consistently, not only on flat plate, but also on round tube, because that's really the project. The project is not welding, you know, flat pieces together. It's welding tube, and that's round, and that's gonna be hard. Let's talk about tubes a little bit. Now, making the transition from flat plate to actually welding tube can be a bit tricky. I know I've been finding it a bit tricky just because of the fact that you're having to constantly adjust your torch angle. So as you start on one side of the tube and as you're welding, you've got to constantly move your wrist so that you're maintaining that proper torch angle. Because if you start here and you just go like this, you're essentially going to be welding at some kind of crazy extreme angle. So if you start on the side or if you start on the top and go around, one way or the other, you're going to have to move your wrist and adjust the angle, as opposed to when you've been welding flat, you can hold your wrist in one spot and just either flare one way like so with your wrist like this, or you can just kind of move your whole arm, whether that's, you know, your wrist is sliding across the table, or if you've got your forearm up on the edge and you're sort of pivoting your forearm like so. Now you've got to get into this kind of a rotation, which is pretty tricky, especially when you're starting. I have found that it is quite tricky as you're starting and as you're learning. So I'm gonna out myself right now and show you probably some of the worst welds I've ever seen and that I personally have ever done. So at first I started with just like a couple of little dry runs here on just on the wall of the tube, not joining two pieces. And you can see these two big boogers right here. So essentially what I was trying to do is, after I got these pieces tacked together in a couple of different places, I got my tacks and I immediately started running from here around to this edge. And because of the fact that after I got my tacks in place, these two pieces, originally it was just this little 3-inch piece and this little piece. So, you know, I'm just welding pieces together as we go along. So this was very hot after I did my tacks. So because of the fact that I started here and I kept going and putting heat in and putting in heat, eventually I blew a hole in the material because I was not controlling my amperage. I was either moving too slow just because I was trying to get that wrist angle just right and kind of, you know, working my way around, or I wasn't using the foot pedal to my advantage. I wasn't backing off of that foot pedal as I started to see this expand and start to kind of blow out here. And so I did a little bit of sort of practice on filling holes on thin aluminum. When you're filling holes on thin aluminum like this, it's never really gonna look super pretty. So I basically did some practice. I had a bigger hole right here. Basically I had a really big hole and a slightly smaller hole. So I did a little bit of practice on, you know, how to fill holes in sheet metal. And the rest of it was not great, really not good actually. And then I had this 3-inch piece and that 3-inch piece, and this is all a good bit better. Again, not perfect, but I would say a far cry from the first example that we looked at. Again, there's you know, a good amount of inconsistency, and I was, you know, sort of flipping the piece back and forth as I was welding it, so I wasn't always welding in the exact same direction. This is just practice anyway, so, but you know, overall, that's a pretty solid improvement over this big, you know, boogered up mess. And so now I took this piece and that piece, and now I'm welding them together. You can see I've got a couple of beads down already. Again, not super consistent, not the best. I had a bit of a dirty start there, but you know, overall not too bad, especially compared to the first attempt. So with that in mind, let's see if we can't make another couple of runs here. I've got one stretch there, one stretch here, and one stretch there. So I've been tacking these in groups of either 5 or 6, because personally I found that if I only grouped in, if I only did 4 total tacks, you know, like 1, 2, 3, and 4 around the outsides, as I'm actually doing my runs, it's just a bit difficult for me as a beginner to get all the way from the edge straight up to the top. So if I can do, say, 5 tacks or 6 tacks, the gap in between the tacks is a little bit shorter. So I can make my run starting from an angle here and start ending about there, instead of having to go a full 90 degrees on the tack, which just makes it a little bit easier. My tendency to dip the tungsten, or the likelihood of dipping the tungsten, will decrease because I'm not having to make such a long run all the way up to the top. I can kind of shorten that distance a little bit, makes it a little easier and a little bit less prone to dipping your tungsten. So let's keep going with this piece and we'll see if I can have this turn out pretty decent. So something you guys may be able to see is that I'm using a little aluminum block. It's about 1 inch thick. This is just a scrap piece that I had from something else I was working on. But what I'm doing is I'm actually using that as an extra wrist rest, so that helps me basically get the angles that I want to be able to get whenever I go to make this run. It's all about, especially with tubes, like as you're rotating and all of that kind of stuff, comfort and just your ability to essentially be steady is got to be one of the most important things, at least that I've found, because if if your torch is like wanting to twist away from the direction that you're trying to travel, and you're having to, you know, put a lot of pressure on it to maintain your grip, and have to, as you're twisting around, you're gonna see the end of that torch get real shaky. And that's the exact opposite of what you want, especially when you're trying to maintain a really, really tight torch height. Little bit of trouble kind of getting that first pull started. I was a little slow ramping up my amps. I needed to get that up faster, get that weld pool and get moving. I noticed that as I was advancing my weld pool, there was a little bit of, it almost looked like the metal that I was approaching as the weld pool is coming across. It almost looked like a hole or a crater in the two unjoined pieces was forming as I was approaching it with the weld pool. And so that means to me that the latent heat of the piece is basically jumping that gap, and everything's getting a little bit too hot. And so I didn't want to blow a hole because I've already experienced that a couple of times. So I backed off my foot pedal just a little bit, maybe anywhere from 5 to 10 amps. I'm not looking at the machine. I'm just adjusting my foot until I see the result that I'm looking for. So not too bad. And obviously this piece is going to be not too hot. Again, it's a shorter run. I'm doing shorter runs intentionally. 1 for heat management and 2 for comfort and not, you know, dipping my tungsten like I've done a million times already. So let me go over around to sort of the back side of this piece, grab a different area and see if I can't work on this before I have to let this part cool down. This 1/16 wall aluminum, once it gets hot, it stays hot. You can maybe do 1 or 2 passes, but you need to basically stop, take a little break, place it, like what I'm doing is once I've done a run or 2, I'll place it in front of my box fan and just let the ambient air sort of fan over top of it to help sort of cool it a little bit quicker. I'm not blasting it with compressed air or anything like that, but you do need to let these parts cool. Otherwise, like, you'll find that your weld pool is developing quickly and is getting really wide, and so you're having to either move really fast or back off on your amps because the part's hot. So you just need to take a break, let it cool down, come back to it, and try again. So let's go ahead for this number 2 attempt. I'm gonna get kind of comfortable. It feels pretty good. Let's give it a shot. Not too bad. A little bit hot. I can tell it's a little bit thin. That kind of how we talked about on the plate metal. I can see that it's kind of sunken in a little bit. It's not. There's not like a super high crown on it where it's, you know, each dab is welded over the top. I probably could be dabbing in a little bit more of my filler metal to get that kind of a profile if I wanted to. But that looks relatively good. So there's one last little stretch that I need to run, but I know my part is hot, considering I can see how sunken in the profile is. So with that in mind, I'm gonna give this just a couple minutes in front of the box fan to cool down, drop temp, and we'll try and do that last little section here, and then we'll come back and talk about it. So as I'm editing this, I realized that my microphone had died while I was recording, but we're just going to take a look at the difference between the 3 welds we did. This first one here on the right, again, we talked about those 2 big holes that I had that honestly look pretty bad, especially compared to the last weld that we did. And then here, comparing the second one to the most recent one, definitely some more improvement. You can see how more sort of glassy the center one looks compared to the one on the left. Basically just means that, you know, we were getting in, getting out, getting the heat in, dabbing properly, doing all of the, you know, keeping track of all of the different variables and different things that we need to focus on while we're running these welds. Obviously you can't really see the penetration in these tubes, but as I was sort of looking down the barrel of these pieces, I could tell that we were getting pretty solid penetration through especially this centerpiece. But that's gonna wrap it up, guys. It's not a super comprehensive video, not super informative or instructional, maybe somewhat. I hope you potentially got some value out of this. But basically to say that if you're starting out TIG welding and you're not very good, it's okay, neither am I. But you know, with consistency, with practice, and being mindful, one of the biggest things about welding, especially as you're starting out, if you don't have an instructor, is to be mindful of the results. So if you do a whole bead and it doesn't look exactly right, think about what that could possibly be. If your bead is super wide or the profile of that bead is super flat, super sunk in, you probably got a little bit too much heat. There's so many different things that go into how to make a TIG weld, you know, perform and, you know, sort of have the correct outcome. There's so many things that affect that. Torch height, amperage, gas flow, cleanliness is a big one. If you are a beginner and you're looking for like a really informative guide, really informative source, check out the fabrication series. If you don't know, he's been on YouTube for pretty much forever, and his instruction is pretty much what I have used to learn everything that I have up to this point. I watched his videos for a good 6 months before I even bought my welder. So the fabrication series, check that one out if you are trying to learn. If you want to follow along and see how all of this intercooler piping turns out, then subscribe to the channel so you can stick around. And until next time, build your dreams.